August 21, 1945. Victory over Japan had been declared just 6 days earlier. But in London, Chancellor of the Exchequer Hugh Dalton opened a telegram that made his blood run cold. President Truman had just terminated the Lend-Lease program. Immediately, no warning, no grace period, Britain owed America for supplies already in transit across the Atlantic. 55% of Britain's economy had been devoted to military production. Exports had collapsed to 1/5 of pre-war levels. The nation's gold reserves were depleted. National debt stood at 250% of GDP. And now, the lifeline that had kept Britain fighting for 4 years had been cut. What happened next would determine whether the British Empire would survive, whether the pound sterling would remain a world currency, and whether Britain would remain an independent power or become an American client state. Britain entered World War II in September 1939 with confidence in its financial position. The British Empire was still the largest in history, controlling a quarter of the world's population and resources. But war is expensive, devastatingly expensive. By 1940, Britain was burning through its currency reserves at an alarming rate under the cash-and-carry system, literally paying cash up front for American weapons and supplies, then transporting them on British ships. The Americans demanded payment in dollars or gold. By late 1940, Winston Churchill had to inform President Roosevelt that Britain was, in his own words, approaching bankruptcy. The gold was running out. The foreign investments were being liquidated. Britain had already sold $335 million worth of American securities at fire sale prices. Churchill wrote to Roosevelt with stark honesty. Britain couldn't continue to pay cash for American aid and fight Hitler at the same time. President Franklin Roosevelt faced a political nightmare. The American public, traumatized by World War I, wanted nothing to do with another European war. Isolationist sentiment ran deep. The Neutrality Acts of the 1930s made it illegal to lend money to warring nations. Congress had tied Roosevelt's hands. But Roosevelt was a political genius. In December 1940, he unveiled his solution during a press conference using a simple metaphor. If your neighbor's house is on fire and they need your garden hose, you don't sell it to them, you lend it. When the fire is out, they give it back. This was the birth of Lend-Lease. On January 10, 1941, Roosevelt introduced the program to Congress. The pitch was brilliant. America would lend Britain the tools to fight Hitler, keeping American boys out of the war while protecting American interests. The United States would become, in Roosevelt's words, the arsenal of democracy. Congress passed the Lend-Lease Act in March 1941 by overwhelming margin. Britain wouldn't have to pay cash anymore. The supplies would be lent, with payment deferred until after the war. What followed was the largest financial assistance program in history up to that point. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States shipped $31.4 billion worth of supplies to Britain and the British Empire. That's equivalent to $433 billion in today's dollars. Tanks, aircraft, ships, trucks, locomotives, food, raw materials, everything needed to fight a modern industrial war. The Soviets received $11.3 billion. France got $3.2 billion. China $1.6 billion. By the war's end, total Lend-Lease aid reached $50.1 billion across all recipients, $690 billion in modern terms, representing 17% of total American war expenditures. Britain became dependent on these supplies. Food shipments kept the population fed during U-boat blockades. Aircraft and tanks equipped entire divisions. By 1944, Lend-Lease imports were essential for Britain's survival. The British economy had transformed into a pure war machine. Civilian production had nearly ceased. Exports had collapsed. The entire nation was mobilized for total war. But there was a catch that most people didn't understand. Lend-Lease wasn't actually a loan, it was aid. The name was misleading. Roosevelt had structured it this way deliberately to get it past an isolationist Congress. The expectation was that military equipment lost or destroyed in combat wouldn't need to be repaid. Britain assumed that its sacrifices, fighting alone from 1939 to 1941, losing over 450,000 lives, absorbing the Blitz, protecting the Atlantic, would be recognized as payment enough. Then came August 21st, 1945. Japan had surrendered on August 15th. The war was over. President Truman, who had taken office after Roosevelt's death in April, signed an executive order terminating Lend-Lease with immediate effect. The timing was devastating. Massive quantities of supplies were still in transit across the Atlantic. Ships that had left American ports before the termination date now required payment on delivery. Britain had been counting on these supplies to begin its recovery. Food shipments, raw materials, industrial equipment, everything Britain needed to transition from war to peace. Now they had to pay for it, in cash, in dollars. Britain didn't have dollars. The announcement sent shockwaves through the newly elected Labour government of Prime Minister Clement Attlee. Chancellor Dalton called it a catastrophe. The economist John Maynard Keynes, who had been warning of a financial Dunkirk since March 1945, saw his worst fears realized. Britain's economy was in ruins. 55% of GDP had been war production, the highest percentage of any allied nation, higher than the Soviet Union or America. 1.4 million men were still in uniform in 1946, draining resources. Cities lay in rubble from German bombing. Infrastructure was destroyed. The export industries that had generated Britain's wealth had been shut down or converted to military production for 6 years. Non-military imports were running at 5 times their 1,938 levels while exports had collapsed. On September 13, 1945, less than a month after VJ Day, John Maynard Keynes arrived in Washington, D.C. He was 62 years old and in terrible health. He'd suffered multiple heart attacks over the previous years. His doctor, a Hungarian named János Pless, had been prescribing increasingly bizarre treatments: opium pills, experimental German drugs, 3-hour sessions of ice packs on his chest, even jumping up and down on Keynes's back as he lay in bed. For this trip, Pless had given Keynes mind-altering stimulants to keep him functional through the negotiations. Keynes wasn't well enough to travel, but Britain had no choice. They needed him. His mission was clear: secure a grant in aid or at minimum an interest-free loan of $6 billion. Keynes believed Britain's wartime sacrifices, fighting for 2 years before America entered the war, losing thousands of ships and aircraft, spending every penny of treasure, entitled them to generous American support. Britain expected gratitude, even justice. Alongside Keynes was Lord Halifax, the British ambassador to the United States, who had publicly stated that he thought little of a rich nation that had no sense of responsibility to its community. The British team spent 3 days in front of the U.S. Federal Reserve, laying out Britain's dire financial situation in excruciating detail. Britain was broke, but the Americans weren't interested in Britain's wounds. They were interested in Britain's recovery, and specifically, how quickly Britain would recover on American terms. The American negotiating team, led by Assistant Secretary of State William Clayton, made their position clear immediately. No grant, no gift, no free money. If Britain wanted American help, it would be a commercial loan with interest, and it would come with conditions. The Americans were suspicious. Many in Washington believed the British were exaggerating their financial crisis to get more aid. There was also ideological opposition. Many in Congress distrusted Attlee's Labour government and its socialist policies. The British Empire's system of imperial preference, trade arrangements that favored British colonies and Commonwealth nations, was seen as a barrier to American commercial expansion. The Americans wanted that system dismantled. They also insisted on one particularly devastating condition. Within 1 year of the loan agreement, Britain must make the pound sterling freely convertible into dollars. This meant that countries holding pounds, like India, Egypt, and other colonies that had accumulated massive sterling balances by selling supplies to Britain during the war, could exchange those pounds for dollars from Britain's reserves. The Americans knew this would drain Britain's dollar reserves catastrophically. They didn't care. On October 18, 1945, after weeks of brutal negotiations, Clayton presented the American offer: $5 billion at 2% interest over 50 years. Take it or leave it. Keynes was devastated. This wasn't what he'd come for. He'd been instructed by Parliament to secure a grant in aid. When he cabled the British cabinet about the loan offer, they were furious. Many in London wanted to reject it outright. But what choice did Britain have? Without American support, the economy would collapse. The government wouldn't be able to feed the population. The pound would crash. Britain would have to abandon its military commitments across the globe in Germany, the Middle East, Asia, the Mediterranean. Keynes knew the alternative to accepting the loan was national humiliation and the rapid end of British global influence. The negotiations dragged on for 3 more months. Keynes's health deteriorated. The stimulant drugs kept him functional, but barely. In a moment of exhaustion or desperation, historians still debate which. Keynes did something unexpected. He showed his entire hand. He revealed to the Americans exactly what Britain would accept in extremis, a loan with conditions, including the convertibility of sterling and the dismantling of imperial trade preferences. It was a negotiating disaster. Once the Americans knew Britain's bottom line, they had no incentive to offer better terms. On December 6, 1945, the Anglo-American Financial Agreement was signed in Washington. The final terms, a $3.75 billion loan from the United States at 2% annual interest, plus an additional $1.19 billion from Canada. In 2024 dollars, that's $60.47 billion from America and $21 billion from Canada. The loan was to be repaid over 50 years in equal installments starting in 1951, with 5 years of deferred payments built in. Interest would accrue from day one. There was also the Lend-Lease settlement. Britain still had $1.075 billion worth of American Lend-Lease supplies that had been delivered after the war ended. These couldn't be kept for free. The Americans sold them to Britain at 10 cents on the dollar, a 90% discount, but still a bill that needed to be paid. This amount was folded into the overall loan package. Effectively, Britain was now paying for equipment that had been shipped under a program explicitly designed not to be repaid. The total amount Britain borrowed, $4.34 billion plus the Canadian loan, bringing the total to $5.53 billion. At 1945 exchange rates, this was roughly £1.24 billion, double the size of the entire British economy at that moment. But the dollar amounts weren't the real punishment. The conditions were. The convertibility clause was devastating. The Americans demanded that within 1 year, any country holding pounds sterling could convert them to dollars at Britain's expense. This was an impossible requirement. During the war, Britain had borrowed massively from its colonies and the Commonwealth, particularly India, paying for supplies with pounds. These countries had accumulated approximately £3.4 billion in sterling balances. When convertibility took effect on July 15, 1947, it triggered an immediate crisis. Within weeks, countries rushed to exchange their pounds for dollars. Britain's dollar reserves hemorrhaged. Within a month, nearly $1 billion in reserves had evaporated. The British government had to suspend convertibility after just 38 days. The damage was catastrophic. The pound sterling's credibility as a world currency was shattered. In 1949, the pound was devalued from $4.02 to $2.80, a 30% collapse. The imperial currency was revealed as a facade. The loan also required Britain to abandon imperial preference, the system of favorable trade terms within the British Empire and Commonwealth. This opened British and Commonwealth markets to American corporations. American businesses flooded in, establishing dominant positions in aviation, telecommunications, and manufacturing across former British spheres of influence. The Americans had also demanded extended leases on military bases in British territory as sweeteners for the loan. Britain's strategic positions around the world were now effectively under American control. Britain had become, in practice, an American client state. The independence that Britain had fought 6 years to preserve from Germany was now compromised by the very ally that had saved it. But here's what they don't tell you in the history books. The loan wasn't used to rebuild Britain. It was used to maintain the empire. Keynes himself admitted this in 1946, stating that the American loan was primarily required to meet political and military expenditure overseas. Britain spent £2 billion, an amount roughly equal to the entire American loan, on policing and administering the colonies between 1945 and 1950. Meanwhile, investment in Britain's domestic economy was minuscule. Between 1947 and 1949, only £320 million went to manufacturing, £262 million to transport, £160 million to energy, and £85 million to agriculture. The loan that was supposed to save Britain was instead spent propping up an empire that was already dying. The repayments began in 1951 as scheduled, 50 equal annual installments of principal and interest, but Britain struggled. The economy recovered slowly. The pound remained weak. The overseas empire drained resources as colony after colony fought for independence. Britain suspended payments 6 times in 1956, 1957, 1964, 1965, 1968, and 1976, whenever exchange rates made payment impractical or when Britain faced financial crises. In 1976, Britain faced a sterling crisis so severe that Prime Minister James Callaghan had to apply to the International Monetary Fund for a £2.3 billion bailout, the largest IMF rescue package in history at that point. The IMF imposed humiliating conditions, effectively taking control of British domestic economic policy. Even then, the American debt remained. The final payment was made on December 29, 2006. Britain chose the last working day of the year deliberately. The amount, $83 million to the United States and $23.6 million to Canada. Treasury Minister Ed Balls issued a statement thanking America for its wartime support. After 61 years, the debt was cleared. The total amount repaid, including interest, was $7.5 billion to America and $2 billion to Canada. Accounting for inflation and interest, Britain had paid back nearly twice what it borrowed. The Anglo-American loan fundamentally altered the global balance of power. Britain entered World War II as one of two great powers alongside Germany. It ended the war as a junior partner to the United States. The loan didn't rebuild Britain. The Marshall Plan, introduced in 1948, provided more substantial aid with no repayment required, and that's what funded European reconstruction. The Anglo-American loan of 1945 was instead a mechanism for American economic expansion. By forcing the convertibility of sterling, the Americans destroyed the pound's status as a reserve currency, clearing the path for dollar dominance. By dismantling imperial preference, they opened captive British and Commonwealth markets to American corporations. By demanding military base rights, they established a global network of American strategic positions. Britain's sacrifice in World War II, fighting from 1939 to 1945, losing 450,000 dead, spending every penny of its treasure, defending democracy when America remained neutral, was rewarded with a bill. Not aid, not a gift, not even generous terms. A commercial loan with crushing conditions that accelerated the end of British independence. The special relationship, so often celebrated in British political rhetoric, was revealed for what it truly was: a relationship between a creditor and a debtor, between a superpower and its client. Today, this episode is largely forgotten in popular history, overshadowed by narratives of Allied unity and American generosity through the Marshall Plan. But the 1945 loan tells a different story. It reveals how financial power reshapes geopolitics more effectively than military conquest. The United States didn't need to invade Britain to supplant it as the dominant Western power. They just needed to present a bill at the moment of maximum British vulnerability. Britain won World War II militarily, but economically and strategically it lost everything, not to Germany but to its ally. The empire crumbled over the next 2 decades. The pound was relegated to secondary status. American culture, corporations, and military bases spread across the former British world, and Britain spent 61 years paying for the privilege. World War II wasn't free. For Britain, the invoice arrived on August 21, 1945, and the final payment wasn't made until the 21st century. The greatest generation won the war, but America won the peace and sent Britain the bill for both. This documentary is produced with AI assistance for educational and entertainment purposes. Historical sources have been consulted for accuracy, but viewers are encouraged to conduct their own research on this complex historical topic.